I know that you guys have been kind of researching this and doing a little background, which is great. And my father is a couple years older than Shig. He's going to be 82 in June, where Shig's going to be 80. My father grew up in Tiffin, Ohio, which is about an hour south of Toledo, back in Ohio. Lived there his whole life, and grew up on a farm in the outskirts in the edge of town, very small town. And any traveling back in the 30s and 40s, you got to remember the Depression was going on, and people just didn't travel like they do now. They didn't have the means to travel like we all do. And back in my dad's junior year, the end of his year, his father was dying of cancer, and unfortunately, my grandfather, I never got to know, died on my dad's 17th birthday, the end of the school year. But one of his dying wishes was that my dad go on to college. My grandfather had a very good friend that had gone to Dartmouth and had recommended it, and so my dad got into Dartmouth, and that's where he was going to go. My dad never laid eyes on Dartmouth College, which is in Hanover, New Hampshire, until he went to go for his first day of school. And that seems really peculiar to us because I know a lot of you have older brothers and sisters or cousins or something that, people start college shopping as early as your sophomore year in high school. And that was it. That's where he was going to go, and he went. And it was the fall of 1941. He rode the train from Ohio out to New Hampshire, got off the train, and took a bus into Hanover, and that was the first time he laid eyes on the campus. He played football that fall. He was having a great experience. And I got to remember being so far away, and I told you about traveling back then. He wasn't going to be able to go back home for Thanksgiving. He ended up spending Thanksgiving at one of his roommates' homes and had that experience. And he was getting a little homesick. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor happened. And as you know and you've been reading about, everyone in the United States' lives changed. And I always wondered, because my dad was a part of the class of 1945, and I was, just assumed he had gone all 4 years and graduated in 1945. And I was trying to figure that out because with World War II going on, because I know that he had went out to sea and served in the Navy. Well, I found out later in life, as I got older and more interested in this, that he had actually accelerated all the classes, and by the next summer he was an officer in the Navy and was shipped out to sea to fight against the Japanese that had attacked Pearl Harbor. I'm going to fast forward. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about the war. No one talked about it. I didn't even hear about the internment camps, any of that. I didn't learn about that till I was in college. These were just things, we heard all about the Holocaust and those things, but we never heard about the things that went on in our country, the prejudice and the things like that. I'm lucky because growing up in the small town that I did, somehow my parents did not raise me to be prejudiced. And I grew up, there was another company in our town that my father worked for some time that had a sister company over in Germany, and families would come over and we would host them. We'd have them for dinner, and I got to be friends with them. There was a family from Japan who we became really good friends with. And it wasn't until I was your age, in 7th grade, I had a teacher who made a comment one day in school saying all these awful things about the Japanese. And how could anyone buy a Japanese product? Because that's when Sony started to becoming big, and tape players and things like that. I know they're all outdated now, if you know what I'm talking about. We didn't have VCRs and all that then. And I went home with that to the dinner table and said, I don't understand why, Kathleen Kabara is one of my best friends. Why is this woman saying these nasty things about the Japanese? And then my parents kind of started explaining it to me. It's because of the war, and some people just can't get over it, and that kind of thing. Fast forward, it's kind of ironic that the person I fell in love with and married is Japanese American. And I learned then through, his father, who you're going to get to hear today, was in the internment camps out in California and moved around. So it's a whole different part of our heritage that some people want to just kind of brush it under the carpet. But it's important that we know about all these things that happen, because we are the melting pot in this country, and we need to overcome our prejudices, and especially after 9/11, the things that happened there. No, right away people were like, oh, we've got to deport all the people from the Middle East and put them in camps. We are not going to make that mistake again. Thank you for my time. I'd like to turn it over to Shigeo Nakanishi.
Thank you, Sue, for that nice introduction. And you too, Brad. You did a great job introducing me. And to all of you, I want to thank you for this, your kind invitation to come and visit with you today. My wife and I now live in a retirement community, and I see old people every day, people who are in wheelchairs or in walkers, And when I come and meet with a group like you young people, it really lifts my spirit, because I can see that you are the future and the hope of this great country that we call our home, America. And someday you will have the responsibilities of running our country the way it can be run, so that we can be a better and stronger America. And I want to thank also the teachers for encouraging inquiry and studies like this, because we are becoming a more diverse culture worldwide because of economic globalization. We now come in contact with people from all over the world. And unless we learn to communicate with them and to understand each other, it's going to be very hard to expand our trade or to do business with foreign countries. And so, to some extent then, the well-being of our country also depends on how we are able to relate with people from foreign countries and foreign cultures. Now, we need to remember also that although we are a strong and prosperous nation, that we are interrelated with other countries, and we do need to develop the ability to discuss and solve problems. Because one thing I found out, being in a camp, here we were, in our particular camp, there were about 18,000 people. We were all basically the same culture, because we were all Japanese or Japanese Americans. But even then, there were problems that came up. People couldn't always get along with each other because they had different ideas, different opinions. And it's only when they could sit down together. And fortunately, the camp was operated by people from Washington and other agencies that were brought up with the democratic and American way of life, and we were able to sit down and communicate and discuss our problems, and that way the problems were solved instead of escalating into bigger and worse problems. So you see, it's only as we learn to work together as human beings that we can hope for eternal peace, because that's finally our goal. We are here on this planet Earth, and we have no other place to go. You can go space exploration, yes, but it's a lot easier to live here on Earth. And we need to learn to live together, take care of our environment, and to develop our country the way it should go. Now, I do have an apology, and I appreciate the PA system, because for the last few years I've had a sinus problem, and you can sort of tell I have a nasal sound. I don't have a cold, I assure you. But because of sinus congestion, it affects my ears. And if I hear any questions and I don't answer completely, just keep trying, and we'll get to the end of the question. I do appreciate the questions that you submitted, because I have my senior moments, and this whole thing happened over 60 years ago. And some things are very clear in my mind, but other things have kind of faded from my memory. And it's as you ask these questions, it helps me to keep the discussion directed the way that you would like to go. So I want you to feel free to ask questions, and I'll do my best to respond. And if I leave any out, well, I keep trying with you. Now, the first, I think I'll begin with the beginning of the war. We were living in California. My father was a farmer. And on that Sunday morning, I was out in the field running a tractor to cut down some of the weeds that grow out there. Now you think, now that's strange. How can anybody be out on a farm running a tractor in the middle of winter? But out there in California, it never snows. Can you imagine not ever having snow? But that's the way it is. And the ground never freezes, which means that all through the winter, the weeds continue to grow. And if you leave it unattended, by springtime, the weeds be just, beyond reach. So even throughout the winter, we used to have to go out and cut these weeds down, and that was my job, helping out on the farm. And I came in for lunch, and my sister, that's Aunt Yuki, she comes running out, and she says, "Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor." And I couldn't believe what she was telling me, because how could anyone think of starting a war, And at that time, I didn't even know what Pearl Harbor was, to tell you the truth. As we listened to the radio and got the news, we realized that Pearl Harbor was a naval base in Hawaii, and that the Pacific Fleet was out there. Well, as we continued to listen to the news, I got more and more angry, because I got to feeling, how can anybody, it's almost like if somebody broke into your home and shot your parents or your family and then trashed the house. That's the way it felt, to have your country suddenly attacked by a foreign nation. But it was true, it was on the radio, it was, then I got to worrying, now what is that going to mean? Does this mean war? Yes. And if war comes, what about my education? After graduating from high school, I was in high school at the time, I was in my junior year, I was 17 years old. So I had another year of high school to go before graduating, and after that I had planned to go to college to study engineering. And this meant, well, how am I going to continue with my education? What am I going to do in the future? Well, the future was pretty much decided when, in May of that year, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, because the Monday after Pearl Harbor, the high school principal called a General Assembly, and we all sat in this assembly room and listened to President Roosevelt give that famous speech on the Day of Infamy. I don't know if any of you watch History Channel, but that was the speech that he made, and he asked for Congress to declare war. The way he put it was, a state of war now exists between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan. So that was the declaration of war, and the beginning of what we call the evacuation or the resettlement. At that time, the reason given was it was a military necessity, because I think the military and some of the people on the West Coast feared that if it came to war, which it did, that there would be some subversive activity, spy and a little bit like terrorism, maybe blow up a plant or something. They were afraid of that, and so they felt that the best thing to do was to move all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. And your teacher had to be this poster.
Mrs. Parent.
Oh, Parent? Okay, yeah, all right, thank you. This poster was posted in all the telephone poles throughout all the towns in California, and it says, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas. Now that meant anybody that had relatives or their parents or their grandparents or whoever that were of Japanese ancestry. That meant EU citizen. And at first I thought, well, now wait a minute, maybe these older people are of Japanese citizenship, but I'm an American citizen because I was born in the United States, and I shouldn't have to go. But the way the law read, it was everybody, including the citizens. And so we had to start making preparations to move out of where we were living, leave everything behind. My father would have to dispose of all the farm equipment that he had, dispose of the farm. We had started over couple thousand tomato plants, because you have to start those early in the year, maybe as early as January. You start planting seedlings, tomato seeds, in what they call a hotbed, and after the tomato plants grow so high, you have to transplant it into what's called a co-frame and allow it to grow to full size so that you can transplant it into the fields to get your tomato crops. Well, we had these thousands of tomato plants. Those you couldn't take with us, so had to leave those behind. And all the farm equipment, all our belongings had to be packed up. We were only allowed to take one suitcase and whatever you could carry, as well as the clothes on your back. So to try to either store or dispose of or pack what we could carry, it was a tough job. And for the next,
Dad?
Yes?
Can you tell them how many brothers and sisters you had?
Oh, well, my father and mother came from Japan in the early 1900s, I believe. And the reason my dad came here, there's so many details going into this by early experience of background that it's easy to forget. But when the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, especially along the Pacific coast, the Central Pacific, the North Pacific, all those railroads had to be built in California, and there was a labor shortage. They needed, the railroad companies that built the railroad needed cheap labor to build the railroads and still make a profit. So naturally what they did was they found that there were Chinese and Japanese laborers that were willing to come and work on the railroad to help build the railroad. And that's how my father was recruited to come to America. And he actually landed in Seattle, Washington, I believe. And from there, my father and mother, after the railroads were finished, I think maybe the contractors thought that, well, after the railroads are finished, they would pack up and go home. But no, it wasn't that easy to go back, you know, after you've started a family here. So they decided to stay here in America and try to build a future for their children and their family. And there were many Japanese people that did this very thing. But unfortunately, what happened was that the people in California at that time, California was an agricultural state. That was the main industry. And these farmers were running these farms, and they saw that the Japanese, because at that time they couldn't become citizens, they couldn't own any land, that was the law. The landowners in the West Coast realized that if they didn't pass a law, pretty soon the Japanese farmer would start buying their own farms, and there'll be a lot of agricultural competition. And so it was partly out of military necessity or military possibility of having the sabotage, and partly because of these economic reasons. They found that now is the time to get rid of all the Japanese from the West Coast.
Hey, Dad, you
Yes?
never answered Sue's question.
Yes.
All right.
Well, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
In my family, after my parents started the family, they had I come from a family of 9. I have 5 sisters and 3 brothers.
Wow.
So there are 9 of us, and to try to raise a family by farming and raise a large family like that is quite quite a job, but they did it because they worked hard. And not only that, my parents really didn't speak English that well. They spoke Japanese, yes, but they hadn't had a chance to go to public school here, and therefore they weren't very fluent in English. And so about the only thing they could do to support the family was to go into something like farming. There were some people who started businesses in what they call Japantown. This was a large group of Japanese people who kind of lived in the same area. And I think that's something that happened very naturally, because on the East Coast, of course, most of the immigrants were Europeans. And at one time there was a large Irish immigration. Another time there was a large German immigration. And as they come into a strange land, because they're in a new community, it kind of helps for them to stick together in their own community, to their own cultures. And so the same thing happened on the West Coast. People who couldn't speak English or who were in a strange country that they weren't used to, they tended to develop their own communities. And those are some of the things that maybe arouse suspicion, because the rest of the state, the people that were living there in the community, really didn't understand what was going on in these different communities. And that's another thing. You know, more and more people are coming into the United States for business reasons or other reasons from foreign countries. And you'll probably find that if there's a large group of people, foreign people coming in, that they are more comfortable in their own community. So they tend to cluster around in their own community, and that begins to then make it difficult for the rest of the community to communicate with them. But I think that's where our school system is such a wonderful thing, because here you meet kids from all cultures, and you get to know each other, you get to understand each other, and because you speak a common language and you learn the same subject, you are able to communicate with them and get along better. Well, that was not the case in California. And so when the war broke out, we had to move out, and that happened in May of 1942. I was in high school at the time, and I had about a year and a half to go before graduation. But after the executive order came out from President Roosevelt and Congress, we had to stop going to high school because we were supposedly in a military sensitive zone. So in the first part of May, we couldn't go to high school anymore. But then by that time, we found out that we had to move. So we started packing like mad. All the stuff that we have, what we could store, we stored in boxes. Fortunately, our neighbor had a basement, and Mr. and Mrs. Reeves were very kind people, and they said, well, why don't you store your stuff in our basement? And so that's where it was kept until we were able to get it out. In other communities where people had to store their stuff, like in a Buddhist church, for instance, you know, out there where you have a lot of people of the Buddhist religion, they build their own temples. And so they brought their packed belongings and stored in these temples, but with nobody watching and guarding it. Later on, it was broken into and stolen and vandalized. So many people lost valuable stuff that they had stored away. But fortunately, most of our stuff we were able to have shipped out after we moved out of camp. Well, anyway, the first place we went to was this assembly center in Sacramento, which is about 50 miles from where we were living. And this was the first place where people from the neighboring area were gathered together before they were put into a more permanent camp. And we stayed there for about a month. Well, let me tell you what that was like. We lived in little temporary tar paper barracks, and the floor was a bare wooden floor with half-inch cracks between them. So if you dropped anything, it fell through the cracks and it was lost. For our mattresses, we were given bags and a pile of straw and says, well, you stuff these bags and that's your mattress. And we laid them on a steel cot they had brought in from somewhere, and that's where we slept for a month. Our food was served and prepared in a mess hall where we stood in line until it was like a cafeteria line only. And that's where we got our 3 meals per day. And one of the questions I think I asked, what did they feed you, if anything? Well, that's a good question because, you've got to eat to stay alive. And most of our stuff was shipped in from the Quartermaster Corps of the Army. So we have things like powdered eggs. We had flour, so we could have pancakes. Once in a while we had bread and milk and orange juice. The basic necessities of life. But as far as meat was concerned, meat was rationed during World War II. So once in a while, we would get chicken, perhaps, or maybe a little beef. But most of the time, and I grew to hate macaroni and cheese because we had a lot of that. And then we had spaghetti and wieners. What you do is instead of using meatballs, you chop up wieners and cook it with the spaghetti. Another thing that we had a lot of was a vegetable called rutabagas, and I didn't like that very much. But by and large, we had fresh vegetables. We could have salads and some fruit, and then the bare meals that the cooks prepared. All the food was prepared by Japanese cooks that. Some had restaurants before they were moved, and others helped in the kitchen, and so they were the cooks, and some of the girls were the waitresses. They served the meals, and that's how we got our meals 3 times a day. Yes.
So we're going to pass this around.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, I have a bunch of stuff and photographs here that is a picture of what the camp looked like, and I'm going to have Brad and Kurt kind of pass them around so you can see. They will be out on the table later so that you can see, more closely what they are. Well, anyway, after the assembly center, we were moved to the more permanent camp, and there were 10 of those camps, 2 in California, 2 in Arkansas, 1 in Idaho, 1 in Utah, 1 in Colorado, and 2 in Arizona. And these were called relocation centers or relocation camps. And they were, again, tar paper barracks. There were about 14 barracks, 20 feet wide by 100 feet long. And they were divided into little apartments. The smaller apartments that were housing the couples, a man and his wife, it was about 20 feet wide by 16 feet long. And then there were other barracks that were divided into 4 apartments, and that would take care of a family of 5 people, okay? And some of the barracks were divided into 4 apartments, and others were divided into 6. The problem was, though, that the walls between the apartments were just a single plasterboard wall, so you can see, you can't see, but you can hear across this thin wall. And until the ceilings were put up with sheetrock, the ceiling was open, so you could hear everything that was going on next door. We had very little privacy, in other words, and they were crowded in these areas, and we had to make do with the best we can to try to adjust to this kind of living. It was a crowded condition, and that's the reason why every once in a while, people would get into arguments, or they had complaints. They'd complain about the food that was being served. They'd complain about the crowded conditions. And but somehow we survived, and I think part of it was because the people that were running the camps tried to listen to the complaints, and we tried to work it out. We had a community council that could bring the grievances and have these sessions where they can discuss problems, and then they would take it back to their various blocks and try to solve the problems that were there. There were about, like I say, 14 barracks a block, and there were maybe 30 or 50 blocks to house the total of 18,000 people in this camp. Now, our camp was one of the larger ones. Some of the other camps were smaller. They had 8,000 or 9,000 residents in it. But what happened was that as soon as the people were moved in and the war was progressing, they realized that this was a tremendous expense. I think the whole program cost a total of about $5.6 billion just to build these camps and house these people. And here there was a labor shortage on the outside because a lot of the fellows were in the service. War plants needed labor, to manufacture the guns and tanks. And so they wanted the people, especially the younger people who were of working age and they were citizens and knew that they could be depended on, they encouraged them to move out of the camp and get jobs away from the West Coast. They weren't allowed to go back to the West Coast yet. They could move eastward to New York and Chicago. And of course, our family decided to come to Cleveland. That's why we wound up here. But anyway, as soon as high school graduation, in July, I think
Wait, back up.
Yes.
So you were in these camps. How many of there in this camp? I mean, I know that 120,000 Japanese Americans
Total, yes.
returned.
Yes.
But there were a lot of camps, and they kept moving you. I heard Uncle George saying, or at Uncle George's Bayview, they were saying how you guys got moved around, and you guys weren't all together. There were 9 kids, but you weren't all together. And were you allowed to go visit your sister down in Arkansas? And could you go into town?
No, we could not leave any of the camps until we actually decided to take indefinite leave and get permission to leave the camp. But in order to get this indefinite leave permission, we had to have some place to go to, somebody to sponsor us on the outside, or a job that we could go to. And I can show you the indefinite leave card that I had to carry all the time, so that if anybody asked, maybe you can pass that around.
Like,
if anybody asked, that they could.
You couldn't go into town and see a movie.
Oh no, we were not allowed to go outside the fence.
No shopping anywhere. You had to stay in the camp.
You were isolated.
Everything was brought in, and there was a barbed wire fence all around the camp, and guard towers where guards were stationed with machine guns and searchlights. So, we were not allowed to go out. And the work crew that worked the farm, because after a while, because there were many farmers, they were able to plant crops and provide food for the camp. And these workmen had to go to the farm, which was outside the gate. So they put them in these trucks, military trucks, and they hauled the crew out there, and they worked all day, and then they would bring them back. But no, we were not allowed to leave. In fact, there were a few incidents where somebody wandered too close to the fence, and the guard, made the mistake that maybe they were trying to escape, which they were not. They were just too close to the fence. And there were a couple of incidents where a resident was shot and killed. But mostly there was very little trouble because of the way the camp was administered, and because people were able to come to these meetings and discuss their problems. And I think everybody realized that, we're here, instead of protesting or having demonstrations, why not try to work together and see if we can make a life better. And that's why the farmers were able to go out to the farms to raise crops, and the residents, some worked in the maintenance to help run the camp, others were teachers. We had a high school that they started.
Okay, that's what I wanted to say. I found this out last night. I'm not trying to take over.
No, go ahead. I mean, there's just too many details to cover. And
well, you know what? It just blows our minds because we just can't fathom it, because we have so much freedom and we just take it for granted. And they built a high school within the camp. They just built a high school, and now you went from your old high school. How many kids would you say were in your whole high school?
I think there were about 200, perhaps.
To 400 in his graduating class. There'd be probably.
I think there were about 400 in there. Was that what you read?
This is his high school yearbook from in the camp, and he's going to have this on the table. And you can look at it, and there's a picture in here. I mean, they had sports. They didn't have interscholastic sports. They had to have their own, it was like intramural. They had their own sports team within the camp because they couldn't. I said, well, did your baseball team go play the baseball team with some other camp? No, they didn't do that. But they did things within the camp, within the barbed wire fences.
Now, Sue, who were the teachers within the community?
Well, we had the head of each department or each subject was usually a teacher from the outside. And they were the lead teacher, and then there were assistant teachers who were residents. Young people who had gone to college, they had some college education, some had degrees. As a matter of fact, our physics teacher was a PhD that had gone to the University of Washington, and he taught physics. My algebra teacher was Miss Pearson, and she was a Canadian, I understand. I had another teacher that taught sociology and history. Miss Barble was her name, and she was a very nice, interesting teacher because before she came to this camp to teach, she had been a private tutor to movie actors and actresses like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney.
Wow.
And so what she did was, when we had our sociology class, she helped us put together a play portraying what life was like. And the kids in our class were actually the actors and actresses to simulate life as it was in the camp. And another thing she had us do was to have a mock trial, a court trial. A couple of the students wrote up a whole story about a burglary and a accidental homicide. Somebody got killed. And so she helped us to organize a court trial. We had a jury that was picked from some of the students in the other classes. And we had a prosecuting attorney, and I got stuck with being the defense attorney. And so we had all these things that, we tried to have school as much as possible like it was normally on the outside. And so there were a lot of experiences that was helpful to us, but I think we need to credit the teachers for bringing us ideas like that. And
Nakanishi, may I ask?
Yes.
Or make a comment? I think what we're hearing and what we had studied, what we're hearing is resiliency, perseverance. I find it very impressive that within the walls of this camp, and as he keeps telling you, surrounded with barbed wire, armed guards, and they may call them an internment camp, but let's be honest, it's a prison camp. But within there, they were able, he's telling us that many of them were able to make a life and to continue on. It says a lot about human nature. It says a lot about a culture that is respectful and willing to work together. And it certainly says a lot about resiliency. So
Yes,
I wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. That's a very important point because, to a large extent, life is what you make of it. And if you have the motivation and the interest and the desire to go on, you can, in spite of what your difficulties and what your, what obstacles you have, you can overcome them if you have the spirit to do it. And I think I have to credit my parents and many of the others. There were all told, I think of all the people, there were 4 different groups of people. What we call the Isseis were the first generation immigrants that came from Japan to make a life here in America. I was a Nisei. That's mean ni is 2. 2 is ni, so that's the second generation. And then there were the Kibeis, they call. The Kibeis were men and girls that were born in the United States, but their parents thought that in order to have a good formal education, they should go back and be educated in Japan. So even though they were natural-born citizens, they also had a Japanese education. So there was those group, and you can tell right away almost what the characteristics are. The Issei, of course, are more traditional. They're used to their old customs and ways. The Niseis, of course, were all educated in the United States. They had gone to American public schools. So they were almost purely American, okay? To us, Japan was a foreign country. I have never been to Japan, and I think I have some relatives there, but I've never met them. I never knew my grandparents. So to me, Japan was a foreign country. This was my home. And to be pulled out of your home, to put into a camp along with all these other people, it's quite an experience. But yes,
we're really fascinated by your ability to overcome those obstacles. Could you tell us how you ended up becoming an engineer for NASA?
All right. Well, as I say, when we went into camp, I was in the second half of junior year in high school. I knew that I wanted to go into engineering. So as soon as I graduated from high school, I started applying for different colleges where I could get an engineering education. But would you believe it? None of the colleges were accepting Japanese American students. I applied to Purdue, but they wouldn't accept me because, I was a descendant of a foreign enemy nation.
I have to say one thing, I'm sorry. He graduated in the top 5% of his high school.
Well, you didn't have to mention.
Out of 400 kids. So he had excellent academic credentials.
Thanks. You didn't have to mention that. But I always did enjoy. But I enjoyed studying and learning. And now that I look back, when you get a chance to learn something worthwhile, go for it. Because at the time, you may not know why you're learning or why you're studying, because you can't see into the future. But let me tell you, sooner or later, somewhere down the line, you find that whatever you learn comes in useful. Like, for instance, we were required to take a foreign language, so I took Latin. Well, whoever heard of taking Latin? But would you believe it? Years afterwards, I can find that if I see a word that I don't understand what it means, if I think of my Latin, that I can tell what the meaning of that word is because it has a root word. But to go back to your question, I get sidetracked so easily because I don't have a formal presentation. But anyway, I couldn't get into college. I tried the University of Michigan. I tried the University of Indiana because my older brother, George, and my sister and brother-in-law were in South Bend at the time, and they thought that, well, at least if I went to a college in Indiana, they'll be close by. Well, I couldn't get accepted at the University of Indiana. I applied to the University of Colorado, no. The Illinois Institute of Technology, no. Ohio State, no. Finally, the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska was accepting Japanese American students. And they had a good engineering school, so that's where I applied. And at first, they said no. It changed back and forth because the laws were changing all the time as to which college was permitted to accept students and which weren't. And for a while, Nebraska was filled up and couldn't take any either. But finally, a place opened up for me, and that's where I went and got into engineering. That after I left, after I got my degree in mechanical engineering, my parents, my brother George, had moved the family to Cleveland, so I came back to Cleveland, and fortunately the NASA laboratory, what used to be the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, that later became NASA, they were a strong engineering research laboratory. So that's where I applied, and that's why I went into service with an engineering degree. And I worked there for 38 years before I retired. And then after that, I was able to work for a consulting company for 15 more years. So engineering has been my life, and it has been a fulfilling life. But that's how I got into engineering. Maybe, before I go on too much further, I really should get at some of the questions they were asked because they were really good questions. I really have to compliment you on the kind of questions you asked because not only is it just the curiosity of it, but I think you're trying to understand what the situation was like and, you can learn from it. So I think I'll try to catch some of those questions specifically. Anyway, that sort of brings me pretty much up to date, aside from all the philosophical ideas that I tried to get across, that no matter what the obstacles are, if you have the right attitude and you want to learn and you're willing to work hard, you can make it. Believe me, you can make it. And if I can make it, you can do the same thing. So, whatever you do, keep up the good work, all right? Before I get started with the questions, there anything that I've left out a lot of stuff, a lot of details. But if there's anything special that you are curious about, if you'd like to ask, I'm open to your questions. Otherwise, I'll go on with some of the questions that I got.
I just wanted to mention something.
Yes?
Yesterday, we were reading a story about a Japanese American Internment camp who ended up picking sugar beets. Well, my Uncle George, he went north and picked sugar beets. I just thought that was
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. Well, like I say, I have my senior moments where all these little details escape me. Well, what happened there was that shortly after we were interned in Tule Lake, that's in Northern California, right below the Oregon border, the sugar beet fields of farmers in Idaho were short of labor. They had raised all these sugar beets, but nobody to harvest them because of the labor shortage. And during wartime, sugar was rationed. There wasn't that much sugar to go around. So it was very important to harvest these sugar beets to produce sugar. And so they came to recruit workers for harvesting the sugar beets, and my brother and quite a few of the other men chose to volunteer to go out and work and harvest these sugar beets. And so George went out to a place called Caldwell, Idaho, and what happened there was a close call, but again, he was very fortunate to survive. Some of the hoodlums, the young people in this particular town, used to go out at night and drive by shooting. And in the bunkhouse where my brother was staying, a bullet came through the window and barely missed him and wound up in a doorpost.
Mr. Nakanishi, did they do that just because they were Japanese? Is that why they were singling out that?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, because here are all these so-called foreign people working in the community, albeit helping to harvest the sugar beet, but that's what's happening. And so they saw that they were maybe foreign and different, but also I think there was some of that monkey business, the horsing around, just something to do, But that's one of the things that happened. There were a lot of other incidents that happened in different places, but what you do is you kind of do the best you can and work through the problem. Okay, shall I get started with the questions then? How was it like to be in the camp? I think I more or less answered that question. We had the 3 meals prepared with food that wasn't all that great. And it was crowded. And for our washrooms, the women had 2 latrines. The men had 1 latrine. It's the whole block of 14 barracks. So in the morning, things got kind of crowded, And then for the mess halls, we'd stand in line sometimes to get our meals. There was a laundry room where our parents did the laundry. And there was supposedly a recreation hall, but it was just one of those 20 feet by 100 feet barracks that was left open without any partitions. Yes.
Now, you just said that your parents did the laundry, but then you also said that some of your siblings were at other camps. Was that because they were older?
Well, by other siblings, by My second oldest sister was married already, and they were from another town. They were living in Fresno. So the people in Fresno were moved to this camp in Arkansas. Whereas
That in the desert?
Beg pardon?
Were those in the, many of the camps were located in deserts, weren't they?
Yes, Manzanar in California, that's the other camp in California, was on the edge of the Mojave Desert. Our camp was in Tule Lake, which was a dried riverbed or lake bed, and there wasn't a single tree in the whole area. All that grew on the ground because the ground was kind of sandy, and you could see little seashells of shell life that lived in the lake. And it was sandy, and when the wind blew, you know, if you get a dust storm. But most of the camps were on rather isolated, unwanted land. The one in Arizona, I think, was also close to a desert area. And Wyoming, there was one in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. That was out in the prairie among the sagebrush. These were actually lands where nobody really wanted, I guess, so the government was able to either buy it or rent it from the owners and then build the camps on that. There are some relics left, some plaques and monuments in all these camps, but there's not a whole lot left because they're tar paper barracks, they're all wooden. Yes?
Who's the oldest of your siblings?
My oldest? Well, she's still alive, believe it or not. My oldest is a sister. My oldest sister is 97 years old, and she got married and lived in Long Beach or Los Angeles, California before the war. My brother-in-law, or her husband, was a landscape gardener, and what he used to do was landscape for some of the movie actors and actresses. They had their home there, and that was his business. Then when the war broke out, why, they moved up to be with us. So we wound up in the same camp. My second oldest sister was the one that was married and living in Fresno. They wound up in Arkansas. My next sister was married to a man that had a garage before the war, and they were living in Stockton, which moved to another camp in Arkansas. And then my next sister, or my older brother, was with us because he more or less had to take over for my dad. My dad couldn't speak English that well, and he was getting old too, so he moved to South Bend. South Bend was where my next sister was living with her husband, and he had a dental lab that before the war, and so he worked for a dental lab in South Bend, Indiana, and that's where they were. And my brother, after coming back from the sugar beet fields and helping to move the family down to Arkansas, he moved up to South Bend, Indiana, and that's where I joined him. My two younger brothers were still in elementary school, so they were still in camp. They stayed in camp until after the war, 1946 or thereabouts, and they were finally moved out. Camp were closed.
What happened to your farm?
My father?
Your farm.
Farm? Well, what happened there in those days, because the aliens, the Japanese aliens and Chinese aliens were not allowed to own any land. So the only way they could farm was to, one of two things. Either they sharecrop, in other words, they work out a contract with the landowner to raise the crop, furnish the labor, harvest the crop, and then they would split the profit, a certain percentage for the landowner and the rest for the farmer. The other arrangement was that you could go to a farmer who owned the land if he was willing to rent his farm outright. But when you do that, you have to furnish your own farm equipment, your own labor, your own everything. All you could rent was the farm, and the rest was up to you. Now, under that arrangement, the farmer could keep all the profit, but depending on what the farm market was like, what the prices were like, some years it was good, the weather was good, you had a good crop. Other years, you know, the market was bad, so you're barely make even. So it was a challenging and difficult life, but what can they do? You know, I mean, if you don't have the formal education.
Well, I guess what I wanted to know is, did you go back to the farm after?
No, we didn't.
What happened?
None of us wanted to go into farming. I certainly
But
didn't.
what happened to all the crops that you left behind? You said you had 1,000 plants that were
It was
already-
lost.
They were all lost, so they
Yeah.
lost
Whoever
all the
took-
profit they would have had.
You know,
You
whoever
lost
took over the farm had the freebie. They were able to take those tomato plants and plant them out in the field, and I don't know what kind of harvest they had, but that was the situation. We had no recourse because time was short. We had only about 2 months to pack up our belongings, to clear up all our possessions, and moved into the camp. So that wasn't enough time to go out and get a good price. We had to do what we could.
That's one of the things. What was that little handheld toy that you got? That the PS2 toy that you guys were
The
talking about?
PSP.
PSP. Most of you know what a PSP is.
Yeah.
Okay, it would be like you go out and you buy a PSP, and they cost how much money? About
250.
about $250. Okay.
Guess who wants?
So I was gonna say, yeah. So you all know what one is. You all know how much they cost, right? So you go out 1 week and you buy this PSP, $250, and because of this order and because everyone's telling you you have to evacuate, hey, I just bought this $250 PSP. Now I want to sell it. So you turn around and you tell your friend, hey, you want to buy my PSP? I'll sell it to you because I've got to leave. Your friend says, sure, I'll buy it from you.
$10. $10.
$5.
Mr. Nakanishi, were you the only one in your family that went to college?
Well, my 2 younger brothers, well, let's see, the brother just below me, he was about 2 years younger than I, he got drafted into the service and he wound up in Germany. And because of that, he had the GI Bill, so he was able to go to college, and he went to teaching, so he had a degree in education. And then when he came back, well, he taught for a while, and then he went into work for the hospital as a medical technician.
So did he get drafted into the United States Army?
Yes.
How
Well,
ironic is
well,
How
that?
that's-
ironic is that?
That's another chapter that thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. That's one of the things that happened that to this day I don't really understand. Well, what happened to me I didn't understand. To some of the others, I do understand what happened. You see, here are all these young people of military age in camp. And we were fighting a bitter war in Europe and in the Pacific. And you know, the military needed help. In the Pacific theater, they needed interpreters who could understand the Japanese language and interrogate them when they got a prisoner. So there were some that were drafted and sent to language school, and they became interpreters. Others joined what is called the 100th Infantry Division and the 442nd Combat Battalion. You might have seen that movie Go for Broke and some of these other films that were based on the exploits of that battalion. But the way they built that battalion up was the military recruiters, the Army recruiters came to the camp, and this was in about 1942, I think it was. And they came to ask for volunteers for the Army to join this combat team. This combat team was all Japanese Americans. And there were some young people who were willing to volunteer, and they joined the Army that way. And they took part in the Normandy invasion, and they rescued the lost battalion out of the Battle of the Bulge. And they fought in Italy. And it was a really, from what I understand, because I wasn't in it, they were a very hard-fighting, well-trained battalion, and they really credited themselves. It was the most highly Purple Heart decorated. They received, as a battalion, they received more Purple Hearts than any other unit in the whole U.S. Army. So they did a great job, and they helped win the war. Yes? I guess I'll ask you, because I'll come back to you, though.
What are Purple Hearts? I don't remember.
Oh, a Purple Heart was the decoration that they awarded you when you were wounded in combat.
Being they still do that.
Yeah, like if you survive it, and it's illegal to wear it if you didn't get it.
And of course, if the person was killed, then the Purple Heart was given to their surviving parents. So it was sort of a medal of honor for bravery and duty to country, you know, for injured in action.
You
Yes.
said Uncle Hugh went to Korea?
Oh yes, that was my youngest brother. Thanks for reminding me of that. I forgot about that too. After World War II was over, of course, then we got into the Korean War, and there was a draft going on, and my youngest...
Dad, either hold it or put that down. It's making noise.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's just
microphone.
just a mannerism. Okay, maybe I should talk in it. That way you'll be able to hear me better, and I would have to shout. I'm so used to using my own voice. Well, anyway, my youngest brother was sent to Korea, and he was working as a mechanic before he got drafted. So he wound up in the Cavalry Corps. That's keeping the tanks serviced, and that's what he did during the Korean War.
Mr. Nakanishi, we're
Yes.
running short on time.
Oh, yes.
So I
Okay.
think what we're going to do is that we have a little bit of a reception for you.
Oh,
so I'm
thank
gonna
you.
ask Kurt and Brad if you could bring maybe your grandfather into Miss Gowdy's room.
Yeah.
Okay, and remember kids, no coffee for kids, okay?
Well, thank you very much for your kind attention, and you're a good group. Thank you for having me.
You guys.
My class, sit first, okay? And Mrs. Nakanishi wants to tell you something, okay?
There's some Japanese candy that's in there, and one of them I can show you. It's one's like a kind of a toffee, and the other one's a fruit. So they're like they're hard candy, and you can all take one that's got Japanese writing on it or whatever.
If you guys want to see like more photos, they're right here. Just like don't touch it a lot or.
My class first, okay? Miss Gowdy.